Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin as it is approaching the bull market support band. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. The first thing I want to mention is just provide an update on the bracket challenge. There are about 787 people that joined. I am currently in 265th place out of 787, but we do have one person in the lead. Our Buckets Picks 2 has 590 points. And then we got Into the Raiderverse with 570, 69% Bitcoin dominance with 560, and they're tied with ETH dominance at 560. So I do enjoy the names. But we'll see who's winning at the end of the whole tournament, and they will, of course, get the subscription, a 1-year subscription to ITC Premium. All right, let's go ahead and jump in here. So with Bitcoin, we discussed a lot about how there should at least be some renewed strength following March OPEX. But one of the things we've discussed many times with Bitcoin is whenever it gets a drop below the bull market support band, usually the result in the short term is sort of a rally back up to it, right? And we've seen that happen many times, right? You know, the sort of that initial drop below the bull market support band, you consolidate for a little bit, you get the rally back up to the 20-week SMA and or the 21-week EMA. You can also see like in 2019, right? You had a drop, you consolidated, and then a rally back up. There's plenty of times where you get that outcome. Because, you know, whenever there is a drop like that, whenever there is perceived weakness in the market, a lot of people will then panic sell, and then the market will go back up for a while, and then you figure out whether the cycle is going to actually continue or not. But this is something that we've seen many times, and it actually happens to line up too with the RSI, which we talked about a few weeks ago, or maybe just like a last week or something. How this is the level that the RSI has been finding support at, and coincidentally, this is the same level that Bitcoin was finding support at in terms of weekly RSI in 2019 as well. And also you can see there was some support there in 2021. So throughout this entire cycle, we've seen Bitcoin find support on the weekly RSI around this level. And as long as it holds that level, then I think you can argue the market structure is intact, especially if it's above 73K. Now, this move here, right? This move here back up to the 21-week EMA, this is ultimately where, you know, you likely set up the summertime. We've talked a lot about that, and you know, in prior years, in prior cycles, where you know, sort of what happens in March through May kind of sets up the summertime. Last cycle in 2021, we had a really strong Q1, and then the summer was actually relatively weak, right? The summer was relatively weak. Last year, the summer was relatively weak, and then the year before, the summer was relatively weak. What's kind of interesting is if you look at quarterly returns for Bitcoin, right now Bitcoin's down. You know, I mean, this quarter it's up a lot today, so it might not be quite negative 11%. If we go look at quarterly returns here, 3-month, it's down about 6%. So I mean, it has rallied a good bit overnight here. So it's down about 6%. Now in 2017, Bitcoin rallied about 8 or 9% from the quarterly open. Now, the key thing that I remembered about 2017 was that the summer was actually pretty good. And it is kind of different than what we saw in the pre-halving year and what we saw in the halving year, where the summer was relatively weak. The question, though, right? The question is, how does that exactly manifest itself if, in fact, it is to happen? One of the biggest differences we've seen this cycle with the 2017 cycle was that in February of 2017, we were risk on and we went to a new high. But in February of 2025, we were risk off, and therefore the March low ended up being lower than the January low. Whereas in 2017, the March low was a higher low compared to the January low. There's one other thing that we discussed as well with sort of following these patterns, and that is, you know, basically the sort of the next time area of risk, I suppose, will just be the macro data that comes out in a couple weeks. There was the tariff stuff on April 2nd, but it does seem like President Trump has slowed down the rhetoric there a little bit, and so I think the window, is going to be sometime out in early to mid-April. Okay, for where does that data actually come in? One of the things that we had talked previously about, and I just want to follow it for the sake of completeness, not because I necessarily think it's the most likely outcome, but if you look at the QQQ, we have followed this for a while, and there's been a lot of deviations, honestly, from what happened back over here. But the main similarities that exist right now between Bitcoin and the QQQ is that, at least so far, the QQQ topped about 54 weeks later after it launched, and after the Bitcoin ETF launched, so far the high has been exactly 54 weeks later. Now, hopefully Bitcoin can take out that high. The good news is that the drop that the QQQ got back then was a much bigger drop. So, if anything, it implies that the market wasn't as crazy as it was back then. That drop was about a 47% drop, right? Bitcoin at this point has only dropped about 30%, right? Now, 30% is still a fairly reasonable correction. We had plenty of those even in 2017. Even the drop that we got in early 2017 that tested the prior yearly high, or the prior high from the year before, was about a 35% drop. So that is still a fairly normal drop. What you'll notice about the QQQ is that in that year, the summer was actually relatively bullish, right? The summer was relatively bullish. There was an immediate drop, right? You first had a wick below the bull market support band, and then you had a weekly close below it, right? So you had a wick below it and then a weekly close below it. If you look at Bitcoin, you can kind of see the same thing, right? You had a wick below it and then a weekly close below it. Then, following that, there was sort of a bounce back up to the 21-week EMA. And then it came back down. But when it came back down, it put in a higher low, okay? So if there is weakness in April and or May, then you would look for a higher low, kind of like what this got. Now, the downside for what happened with the QQQ is once Q4 arrived, the markets crashed into a recession. If that is the case, there's still a good chance that that would take some time to play out. I think a lot of people think that layoffs lead to, or that layoffs lead to stocks going down, but it's really the other way around. Like the stock market going down leads to that stuff. And you can kind of get into like a negative feedback loop. So what I'm watching right now is how this plays out with Bitcoin back at its 21-week EMA and approaching the 20-week estimate, because the QQQ did the same thing. Now, where it has deviated and at least provides some glimmer of hope is that when you look at Bitcoin's drop here, the weekly close that it got was actually still above the wick from the week before. Whereas with the QQQ, the weekly close completely took out the wick from the week before. So from where I'm sitting, right, it looks like the QQQ had a much more massive drop and then a multi-month attempt to repair it that ultimately failed, and it wasn't obvious until about late Q3 going into the fourth quarter of the year. With Bitcoin, we haven't seen as big of a drop, but the structure of the market hasn't necessarily deviated just yet. If you look closely at the QQQ, you'll see that when it dropped, it basically just came back down to where it had already gone on a weekly close, right? It just went right back there. So for Bitcoin, that would be, back down to around 80K or so. Now there was a wick below that. And as I've said before, as long as Bitcoin holds above 73K, then the structure of the market does in fact remain intact. So I do just want to talk about that and how how to sort of think about this as we go forward. I do think there is a really good chance that there would be some type of a rally, and it's possible we're already in it, right? It's possible that we're already in it. In fact, I mean, the market's been going up for 3 weeks. We talked about sort of like a counter trend rally at the very least, right? And this is that rally at the very least, right? It's a counter trend rally at the very least. Hopefully, it leads to new highs. But when you think about the structure of the market and how this ultimately play out, I know that sometimes that weakness can come back a little bit before the market really takes off, right, into sort of a move that makes you really question whether the high is in or not. And we actually saw something similar last time that the Fed slowed down quantitative tightening. If you look at like the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve, right, I mean, you can see pretty clearly that when the Fed slowed QT back in May of 2024, they announced it in May. It didn't actually slow until June, but they announced it in May. What it initially happened is, the market went up, and then there was a little bit more weakness like a week or two later, and then it got a stronger rally. So that's only the reason I'm mentioning it, is because sometimes on the first approach to the bull market support band, it can find weakness as it gets into that level. You can see that it did something right here, similar, right, up into the bull market support band, and then weakness for a week or two before going higher. Similar idea over here, although it did go above it, but it then found weakness on the other side of it. And then if you look at like 2019, right, you got a drop below the bull market support band, and then a rally back up into it, and then it ultimately led into a lower low. And then you could argue that this is where the cycle was actually getting back on track, and then the recession hit. So that's the way I'm sort of thinking about this right now, is that the bull market support band is going to be that critical level for Bitcoin to get through. And right now, it essentially ranges from about the current price, right, from around 88.5K, 88.4K, all the way up to 95K, right? So 95K essentially is where the 20-week SMA is right now. And that is going to be sort of your main line in the sand, because it also corresponds to the lows basically from back over there, right? That is going to be a pretty big level. So if it does get rejected here, like if it sort of comes into it and then comes back down and then goes back up again, that would be sort of the big area to look at to see if it can get back above it. And that would of course take place, sometime this summer. Okay. So in order for the market to really get back on track, there has to be a lot of repair done. And that hasn't happened yet. It doesn't mean that it won't, but it just hasn't happened yet. We need to see the market repair itself and get back above 90K. And this is the sort of the support level that it finally broke back over here between February OPEX and March OPEX. We said there was likely going to be a drop between that window. Now March OPEX is over. You're seeing risk on come back into play a little bit. And my guess is that the next sort of concern, maybe there's a little concern around April 2nd, but it seems like they're trying to walk some of that stuff back. My guess is the next thing will just be sort of the macro data that comes out in early to mid-April as sort of whether this can get through the bull market support band, or if it gets a rejection, comes back down, and then tries again this summer, which I could totally be on board with. I could totally be on board with that idea. I do remember in 2017, there was weakness in the market for a little while, and then once you got out further into the summer, things changed. So that's what I'm currently looking at. As far as Bitcoin dominance goes, I think it will continue to slowly trend higher. I think Bitcoin, can use liquidity from the altcoin market to hopefully sustain itself for longer. The fact that all Bitcoin pairs are still way up here suggests there's liquidity that may eventually find itself back in Bitcoin. So do remember that and keep that in mind, because I know, sort of the discussions around QT and whatnot, slowing have called for people to sort of, make certain bold predictions about altcoins, but I still think that most likely outcome for alts is to bleed against the king, and I didn't think it was going to take this long, but it is. It doesn't mean it's not ultimately going to play out. So those are my views. Bitcoin should still outperform most of the rest of the market. So Bitcoin gives you exposure to the upside. It still minimizes your downside, because even if there is a drop, like even if there is a rejection off the bull market support band, you can imagine that alts would get wrecked even harder. So imagine a world where Bitcoin goes back up, comes back down, and then goes up again, right? That process, that choppy process, causes things like Bitcoin dominance to ultimately go higher, right? That's what that choppy process over here caused Bitcoin dominance to slowly go higher. So when a lot of people ask, well, is Bitcoin dominance going to go higher on a Bitcoin rally or on a Bitcoin dump? My answer is always yes. Like it's usually a combination of both that ultimately leads to that outcome. So those are my views right now. The major hurdle for Bitcoin that it needs to get past is the bull market support band, in my opinion, right? In my opinion. I'm not unsympathetic to the idea of a rally beyond it, but I also know that a lot of times on the first approach to the bull market support band, there can be a rejection followed by another later attempt, right? And we saw that last year, a few attempts, and then finally it broke through. We saw that in 2019 as well, right? It dropped below it, rejection, and then finally it broke through. And then, of course, we had a recession. But even here, right, sort of a drop down, it rallied back up almost to the 21 KMA, and then it was on the second attempt that it broke through. So if you do see some weakness by Bitcoin after really getting into that bull market support band, that is a fairly normal sort of behavior for Bitcoin to sort of exhibit. And then the expectation would be that it would then come back down, either put in a slightly lower low or a slightly higher low, something like that, and then try again. Last year, it was a slightly lower low, right? You had a rally and then a slightly lower low, and then it tried again. In 2019, it was a slightly lower low, and then you tried again. But in 2023, right, I guess it was also technically a slightly lower low. But again, there are times where it would be a higher low, and I mean the QQQ is an example of that, right? A drop, rally back up into the bull market support band, a bounce back down, or a drop back down, and then sort of a counter turn rally back up. So that's what I'm thinking. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, check out the Selling Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.